So, this is one of the more interesting, I have to admit, scenarios I've been asked to discuss because it is a really interesting point to start looking at the German system and the German naval limitations. It's also one of the more difficult because there is not as much headroom to play around with as there are in other scenarios. Even the Italians, in a way, have slightly more headroom to play around with. Why? Because you have the polycratic nature, well, the autocratically polycratic nature of the German government, in that you have many competing, for want of a better phrase, little Hitlers. And this is going to make YouTube very happy with me. Who are competing for power for themselves and their own departments, and growing and doing that by mostly competing for the attention of the big Hitler, of course, Adolf Hitler himself. And the Navy falls into that category just as any other department does. It really does. And the Scharnhorsts give you a sort of good idea into what could have been, but also give you an idea into what wasn't. Because one of the interesting comments that's come out from some people is they keep going, well, what they should have done is gone with a better Scharnhorst, or the Bismarck was the Scharnhorst when it was fixed, and that couldn't be further from the truth. If that was the standard, if it was literally Scharnhorst, they took the Scharnhorst design, they evolved it on, they fixed the issues with it, and the issues it had were actually less than the Bismarck's, cumulatively. And then, built that into a Bismarck, that would have been an excellent ship, but they didn't. Because the Germans don't do that. The Germans don't do evolutionary design and construction. They do, let's go big. This is why it's so attractive to so many people when they look at the German systems and their write-ups and their stats, and they're going, this must be so amazing on paper. And then you talk to the people who look at it when it's working in reality and go, no. Because they have so many good ideas on paper. All their capital ships, whether they're the Deutschland class heavy cruisers, and heavy cruisers, please note, that's what the Deutschland class are. 11-inch guns they might have, but they are heavy cruisers. They are where heavy cruisers probably should have been, tonnage-wise, but they're heavy cruisers. And that's not a bad thing to say about them. The whole pocket battleship mythology can cause them a lot of trouble because it can cause them to be compared to things which frankly they could never rank in against and would just massacre them. It's like the description of the Scharnhorst class as battle cruisers. They're not. They are fast battleships. They are fast battleships produced when this was the limitations of German technology and infrastructure and what they could produce in terms of their maritime industry. But still good ships, useful ships, and a good basis for this plan, and a discussion point, because basically the entire theory and the entire way I've taken this question, which was proposed by Steve Clarke, is down the efficiency route. So basically, the scenario is you have someone like Speer or Speer-like in charge of the German forces procurement earlier on. Now, I am not going to claim he was actually as amazing as he's cracked up to be. Honestly, he really isn't. He does the best he can, but even he isn't able to accomplish as much as would have been needed done to make the German armed forces and procurement in any way, shape or form efficient. When you are literally producing tanks that you're supposedly producing in the thousands, but you're producing them in runs of 5 and 10 because you keep making changes in them, that is not a sign of efficiency. It's basically a sign of being change happy. We can make them, you're striving for a perfection of vehicle, which is it's a goal. It's a great goal to have, but the trouble with striving for perfection in every individual vehicle, making it the best it can possibly be, and every individual ship making it the best it can possibly be, is you lose all the advantages of training through having multiple ships of the same type. You lose all the advantages of logistics in terms of parts through having ships of the same type. You lose all the advantages of operation. If we consider the Scharnhorst themselves, Scharnhorst is capable of 7,100 nautical miles at 19 knots. Gneisenau is capable of 6,500 nautical miles at 19 knots. Sometimes listed as low as 6,200 nautical miles at 19 knots. In fact, probably more likely 6,200 and 6,500, because one is the theoretical number that she could do, and one is the practical number, and 6,200 is the practical number. They're the same class! They're built at the same time! Yes, they're built in different yards, but lots of ships are built in different yards. But if you go and look at the British battleships, they're built in different yards. And then you look at their ranges, etc. They're all within roughly the same range. 50 or 100 nautical miles, maximum differential of each other in terms of across the class. And the 100 nautical miles is when you have distinct batches. I.e. the King George V's, where you have sort of the batch 1, which is King George V and Prince of Wales. The batch 1A, which is the Duke of York, and the batch 2, which are Anson and Howe. They are slight changes and slight variations as they go on. But they're still pretty darn similar within the muchness, and honestly, most of the changes come about because the Royal Navy's suddenly not bound by the treaty system, and not even the political class are trying to keep it to some sort of theoretical treaty system, so it can actually build what it wants to build. And hence you have the evolution and differentials, and also hence you have the changes being chucked to the Lion class to such an extent it's actually cheaper and easier to stop building them and build new ones, and that's what they were going to do, but of course that meant the Lions were never actually built. So Germany doesn't do standardization well, and this is again why I go back to someone Speer-like. Speer, but more capable. Speer-like in terms of looking for standardization and able to accomplish some of that, but able to accomplish it earlier. And so the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, is forced to standardize. They're going, right, you're going to build this hull, and it's going to provide the same hull type for all your capital ships and all your carriers. They're all going to be built from the same hull. We'll accept the limitations. We'll accept carrier might not be able to carry as many aircraft. We'll accept that the battleships might not be as big as others are building them, might not be as capable individually. But the thing is, if we standardize, there are going to be three effects. One, we are going to be able to standardize the training, and therefore the getting crew ready and getting crew into service. And if we consider the sheer number of naval personnel and Air Force personnel who serve in ground divisions in World War II, this is what I always find funny when people go, well, they'd have had trouble generating number of personnel for these ships, etc. No, they have more personnel than they have enough for ships, so they start turning them into ground divisions. That's not sensible. That's not a good use of naval personnel. So you could have crewed slightly more ships. Probably would still be producing quite a few ground divisions, but you could have crewed slightly more ships. And if you are building more ships, well, the thing is, individually they might not be as capable as you could build, but cumulatively they might well be more capable, especially on a strategic level. Because one of the problems for the Germans throughout World War II was forced generation in terms of its fleet. It never had enough destroyers. Admittedly, the Royal Navy had kind of seen to that after the Battle of Narvik. The third battle. First battle was the Germans fighting the Norwegians to get into Narvik. Second battle was when the H-class turned up and found the Germans were in Narvik. And third battle was when the Royal Navy sent some destroyers, some tribal-class destroyers, and HMS Warspite in to make sure the Germans never got out of Narvik. That kind of takes... more importantly than the ships lost, it massacres their senior crew and their experienced crew, both in terms of taking them out and killing them, but also in terms of destroying their morale and giving a lot of them a lot of problems to deal with afterwards after what they've seen the Royal Navy ships doing. You are one of the problems with training a force to be an elite force and making them think they're an elite force is they expect themselves to act like an elite force. It's one of the tricks in training. If you tell someone they're elite, they start to live up to the image of what an elite is. If they then lose a fight badly, i.e. in a way in which they are completely overmatched, completely overwhelmed, completely boxed in, and you destroy that image in their head because they think they're the elite, they're supposed to be able to match in against these people. The reality was there's a difference between the Royal Navy destroyer design and the German destroyer design. The Germans have gone for the most powerful destroyers they could build and trying to basically build mini cruisers in terms of their firepower and guns. The Royal Navy had gone with the tribal class, well, as many destroyer level weapons as they could on a ship. Why? Because they realized that destroyer level weapons are fine for stabilizing on a destroyer sized hull. Guns bigger than that, they're problematic to aim and fire. They might, if they hit, they will cause more damage, but the thing is, they depend a lot more on stability. The larger the gun, the more it depends on the stability of the platform firing it. This is another reason why you want, if you consider the Belfast class, of the Town class, are far more accurate. Belfast and Edinburgh are in their long-range 6-inch fire than some of the smaller light cruisers which have 6-inch guns. Conversely, the Refusers also match in against as well, but that's because they're dealing with the effects of 6 guns. There are points in the design of the Royal Navy light cruisers where they are actually almost fitting too many guns for the size of hull, and it causes issues with the stability and the aiming because of what happens when you fire the guns, the way the hull reacts to the pressure of firing. And you can modify that, you can stagger it and all sorts of things to alleviate the effects and keep up your accuracy. So it doesn't cause much of a problem, but it's there as a factor. And the smaller the ship is, the more it is a factor. So the Germans had lost their destroyers early on, sadly for them. But even their destroyer classes had lacked standardization. So the big impact of this that I'm going to roll throughout the scenario is standardization, i.e. the Germans have standardized. The Germans have picked designs. In 1935, they have gone X, Y, Z. Boom, boom, boom. Everything now will be an iteration on these. They will be an evolution at best. With destroyers, it's going to be evolution at the flotilla level, i.e. we're going to produce a flotilla, and then we're going to produce the next flotilla. There are going to be no changes within a flotilla. They are not going to evolve. They're going to be there, and then if you have suggestions, it's going to be the next flotilla which they go into. And then they're all going to be built to the same design. And it's going to be the same with these ships. They're all going to be built to the same hull. This is going to be designed with a suitable barbette and a suitable carrier design. And we're going to get into all that. But it's all about what happens if the German Navy standardizes. And it's an interesting scenario to look at because, honestly, for the Germans, if they all standardize, they can produce more ships. They can have a slightly more numerical force available. But the thing is, and the problem I'll be getting into for them, is that the other forces around them have the infrastructure and the ability to react more quickly to their numbers than they have the ability to build up more numbers, even if they are standardizing. The problem for the Germans is they're in a catch-22. It's kind of like the Japanese and the Italians to an extent, in that they can produce very good designs, but it's producing either enough or producing a design capable enough that it can overwhelm the numbers it's going to face. And that's a nigh on impossible task. That's an nigh on impossible challenge. Anyway, shameless book plug. Currently, 2nd edition is for sale. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your support. Seriously, this channel would not be where it is today. I would not be where I am today without you. If you've read the news recently, you'll see that there's another couple of history departments in the UK which are suffering, which are laying off staff. And this has been a general trend. There are lots of history departments which are laying off staff, and I have to admit, naval history is one of those areas which seems to have suffered quite a lot. It's not necessarily in vogue, sadly enough. And without you, being a historian, a full-time historian, would be, well, it would be where my heart would be at, but it would be financially impossible and financially irresponsible. It just would be. It would be completely fiscally irresponsible. So thank you. Thank you for keeping my dream alive and making it possible. And I hope you enjoyed history. Today has been a fun day as well. My mum decided to fall down the steps. Luckily they're wooden steps, and luckily it was only 2, and she's okay, she's fine, she caught herself, picked her up, took her to medical attention, got her sorted out, but yeah. That is why the Seidlitz class video didn't go up yesterday, and why this one is being recorded late on Friday night, and why there was no live on Twitch on Friday night. Just not the time. So let's consider the Scharnhorst design, and the point is we're not considering it in terms of its protection, because frankly that will probably be the thing that's evolved most. We're not considering it in terms of its firepower, because again that will change with the evolutions. That might well be 15-inch guns. What we're considering it is its base points, its speed. So it's top speed. Is that fast enough for a carrier? Yeah, 31 knots, that's fast enough. We like faster, but 31 knots will do. 31 knots will do for a carrier. Especially if you consider with a carrier design, you'd probably be taking off quite a lot of the armor. You're probably taking off, well, let's be honest, they have a 13.8-inch belt. You probably will halve that. You will probably halve that belt, and that will be a lot of weight off. Might not make her much faster, but it might add something to it. They're all based on 3 steam turbines driving 3 screw propellers, supplied by 12 boilers. It works. Now, I haven't put in a range here because 7,100 nautical miles versus 6,200 nautical miles in realities. I'm going to pick from the top of my head standardization. Say they managed to standardize. I'm not going to go for 7,100 because that gives them. That's basically saying they standardize on the best scenario, and if you standardize on the best scenario the whole way through, you give people unfair advantage. But I'm also not going for 6,200 because that's going for the worst the whole way through, and that's giving them an unfair disadvantage. So if we take 6,200 and we add it onto 7,100, we end up with 13,300. If we divide that by 2, we end up with 6,650. So, their range at 19 knots is going to be 6,650 nautical miles. There you go. We have balanced it out. Overall length 235 meters. This is not that bad. There are carriers around which are about that length, and in fact have takeoffs, etc. Actual flight decks which are less than that, so that's viable. And a beam of 30 meters, which means she's wide. For a carrier, for a carrier design, they'd be wide. For a capital ship, it'd be fine. I'm also not going to change the number of turrets there. They're free turret design. They're going to keep as a free turret design. Their options are going to be triple 11-inch guns or twin 15-inch, because again, that's what the Germans are actually working on. The Germans work on a 15-inch. They work on 11-inch. Yes, I know they have ideas for their various classes of battleships to come with more. They always have plans for more. The H-class slowly grow up in terms of design of guns and get bigger and bigger and bigger. Their primary goes from 16-inch to 16.5-inch to 18.9-inch to 20-inch. between the H-39 and H-44 designs. They build the 15-inch. It's put in service on a ship at the 15-inch. We'll go with the 15-inch. One other thing, a starting point for me always when I'm doing alternate histories, when I'm looking at these sort of realities and these scenarios, is to keep it as close to history as possible. So we can learn some of the lessons for the history. Because that's what alternate history allows you to do. If you do it properly and you do it with enough research and enough thought process, you can really shed a light on the actual history and why things happened. And honestly, to me, this is the other methodology of the Germans to try and square that circle of the fact they didn't have enough infrastructure to build up. Force Z was never going to take place, never going to be built. You know, the Plan Z, whatever it's going to call it, it's never going to be built. In a nice way, by the time it would get built, the Royal Navy could be building a class to replace the King George V's. If they wanted to. The British have that much infrastructure and that much available funding for their Navy. Because, let's be honest, if you're whilst you can theoretically go to Germany, oh, Germany has more population, they have more this, they can of course fund Navy. Yeah, they can, but in Britain, the Navy and the Air Force take the lead in terms of funding. The Army has been funded. It is mechanised. It is, and I've had this conversation with people about in the past about the British Army. They go, well, it wasn't fully mechanised because there's these batches of yeomanry in the reserve who are cavalry. And, they were horse mounted. And before they go to war, what have they done? They are sent off to Palestine. And they are reconfigured in Palestine to armoured warfare units, to armoured units and mechanised units. The thing is, they are reservists. They were on the plan to be converted, and they would have been converted by 1942, and probably by 1940, if war hadn't broken out when it did. They weren't deployed to an active war zone. They were deployed to a zone where they could relieve troops who had been trained up on the equipment, and from there they were transitioned into a modernised unit. At no point does the British Army use horses for its major fighting forces. Now, if you had actually pointed out in terms of mules for logistics, yes, the Indian mule train does turn up in Europe because they're, of course, preparing many of them for a high-tech version of 1914-18 and trenches, and therefore mule teams are useful. But where is this all coming from? Well, that's the British Army. The German army takes precedence. Next, you have Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe. They're going to take precedence, especially as he's the person in charge of the 5-year plan, and the Navy have traditionally linked themselves to the 5-year plan for their procurement, which was one of the reasons why they struggle so hard to get decent numbers of submarines, etc. in service, is because of Goering being in charge of the procurement process. So this is why, honestly, the Germans give the British a bit of a head start in the anti-submarine war, because they're putting their best technology out to sea, but not in numbers that the British are having to deal with. And whilst there are peaks and there are periods where the Germans cause more trouble than others in terms of the anti-submarine warfare, the fact is, thanks to Goering and his really, really, really inefficient leadership of procurement and industry, it never gets the numbers that the British do not have enough and the Allies do not have enough escorts to manage the problem. And yes, we hear about the convoys which are attacked. Look up the number of convoys run and look up the number of convoys which are talked about on a regular basis. For every convoy that is devastated, there are about half a dozen or so which get through and never see a German submarine. Mostly thanks to intelligence. And I'm not talking about brain power, I'm talking about information being gathered by various decrypts, etc. And, of course, by signals intelligence, which is when we refer to the examination of signals traffic and the location of signals traffic, which is often a forgotten part of Bletchley Park because it's not as sexy. Let's be honest, decoding their information and finding enemy, that's far more sexy than, right, and there's a lot of signals coming from there, and we heard this beep and this beep response from here and here, so we reckon the enemy are there. That's just not as sexy. It doesn't do as good a movie. You don't have as many dashing, surprisingly attractive academics and engineers and scientists wandering around, thinking and puzzling over problems. It's terrible. They do a lot of work though. So the Scharnhorst design, the whole point is the German Navy is always competing against the army, against the Luftwaffe, and to do so, they're never going to win. Because Germany has land borders, because they need their air force for all sorts of operations, the Navy is always going to come into third place. So, even though they have on paper a lot of industry, a lot of industrial capability, a lot of infrastructure capability, a lot of population capability, it's never going to be deployed the same way. And that is a problem. That is a problem for the Germans. And it's a big problem when you get to them building their battleships and battle fleet, because they have a choice. And as historically what they do is they try and build the biggest and best ships they can build whenever they can build them, which is why you jump from Bismarck and Tirpitz to the H-class. Why you are jumping to that sort of level of ships. Why you're talking about building something which would be 131,000 tons in the case of the H-44. It's the same idea. They're going down the same route as Yamato. And it's interesting enough, no one's ever put forward the question of what about Japan if they'd standardized on a design and just on one of their basic designs and just churned out hulls as quickly as they could, and then in the fitting process either fitted them to be capital ships or aircraft carriers. No one's ever asked that question. And that's an interesting one. Japan has slightly more infrastructure headroom and slightly more financial headroom in terms of naval procurement to be able to get away with that, and the Navy is far higher up the pecking order than it is in Germany. So it's potential. But in Germany, they can't. They go the Bismarck route. Under this scenario, they go the efficiency route, and they try and produce as many of these ships as they can. They're not going to be used for a surface radar. I do not see a scenario where a Scharnhorst design is sitting down there fighting the Battle of the River Plate. Because the one thing the German Navy had remembered is the lessons of Goeben and Breslau. The fact is, Goeben and Breslau, as attractive and as heroic story as they make, going off through the Mediterranean, dashing to be part and sort of through the Dardanelles and support the Ottoman Empire and eventually be owned by the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey, they're not that advantageous for the Germans. They don't help them that much. You consider what force they tie down in the Mediterranean to face them. A load of pre-dreadnoughts. Or sovereign-style battleships, as I prefer to call them. They have Lord Nelson and Agamemnon. The two semi-dreadnought, to an extent, ships that were built alongside at the same time as dreadnought, sitting in the Mediterranean. They are there to try and hold them in. When they go out for a foray, they manage to bump into some monitors, do some damage, sink them, and get away. But they go for a minefield to escape the British and damage themselves. That hasn't helped them. Having capital ships cut off in other places in the world doesn't help you. And the Germans remember that. They really do. So I don't see a Battle of the River Plate with a Scharnhorst design scenario coming on. So, what's the base point for our standardization? What are we looking at? Well, Scharnhorst come in at 143.5 million Reichsmarks, or 146.2 million. If we consider their hulls were mostly built in 17 to 19 months, and then because Scharnhorst was slightly rushed, she then took longer to commission, because the reason she was rushed was to make way for space for the Tirpitz to be built. And still, even though they rushed her off and launched her on the 3rd of October 1936, it wasn't until a month later, a month had passed, they actually laid down the Tirpitz. That's how much work they needed to do to differentiate between the two hulls. So, we also have Blom and Voss, Hamburg, who can build the Bismarck. So that gives us a third yard. Theoretically could do the construction. Now, the price differential for the Bismarck, 196.8 million. The Tirpitz, 181.6 million, and the Graf Zeppelin, 92.7 million. So the Zeppelin's the cheapest by a long way here. But there is also quite a big differential of, if we consider between the Scharnhorst, which is the cheapest of the Scharnhorst class, and the Bismarck, that differential is 53.3 million Reichsmarks. Now again, one of the joys of standardization is usually if you keep building the same thing, it gets cheaper. If you keep building the same thing, it gets cheaper. This is why the Type 23 frigates, the last ones, were costing around £60 million. The first ones had cost 120, 130 million. But the Royal Navy built 16 of them. And every single time you're building more and more incrementally on what you already have in existing stocks and existing capabilities. So the cost to add the new units goes down. So when we're looking at this in terms of the construction stats, you can see very quickly that if the Germans had kept building Scharnhorst and evolved Scharnhorst rather than going for new, revolutionary, the best, they could have had a reduction in costs. Now, the Graf Zeppelin is still the cheapest there, so there's this argument of, oh, should they have just kept the Graf Zeppelin? Well, there is a second part of this question, which is they use Japanese-style technology and go with a Japanese-style methodology for their aircraft carriers, rather than going with what was an engineeringly perfect system which they were inspired to follow by the French. Look, I don't like to mention the burn in videos. It's kind of like the Blackburn. Somehow, the mentioning of that particular aircraft has caused a small religion to arise in amongst my subscribers. I'm still not quite sure. It's still one of the most ugly aircraft, if not the most ugly aircraft ever. I'm fairly certain it's the most ugly aircraft to ever fly from a ship. And you should definitely not look it up if you want to save your eyesight. And it's rather similar to the Burn. The Burn is probably the most engineeringly interesting aircraft carrier ever built, but in terms of practical utility, it is beyond the pale. Because a lot of the ideas it has, which are to produce the most engineeringly perfect solution, end up working against each other to make it operationally one of the weakest ships ever designed. There's a sort of pattern emerging here. If you design something to every single component to be engineeringly perfect, i.e. 100% solutions for their small part of their job, they tend to not necessarily work well together. They all have requirements, and very specific requirements, whereas if you design a system which is supposed to be overall most efficient at generating aircraft, it might not be the best systems individually, but cumulatively it is the best effect. And both France and Germany suffered from a similar problem of what I would call institutional committeeization, i.e. a lot of people who are members of committees who have their own pet projects and making deals with other people in their pet project on the committee to get their pet project in because this is the best solution and it definitely will work. And it does work. But the trouble is, add all those solutions together, you have a mess. On an even larger scale than a Tiger tank. So, Japanese carrier options, what can we base this on? Well, again, if we remember our Scharnhorst stats, we've got the Soryu, which was carried 63 aircraft and 9 reserve aircraft, and laid down in November 1934, launched in December 1935, commissioned December 1937, and top speed 34 knots, length 227.5 meters, and if you look at the design, her flight deck doesn't even extend all the way to her bow, so much shorter than a Scharnhorst. Beam 21.3 meters, so far narrower than a Scharnhorst. Okay. Let's consider the Shikakus. Ooh. They're laid down December 1937, launched June 1939, commissioned August 1941. Top speed 34.5 knots, so fast, again, faster than the Scharnhorst. Length 257.5 meters, so longer, definitely longer, 22.5 meters longer, but again, the thing is the flight deck doesn't extend the whole way to the bow, and beam's 29 meters, so the Scharnhorst is still fatter, still beamier. So if this is the sort of Japanese carrier tech you're looking at, you can produce something decent. Now, you're not going to have deck parking, and you're going to have slightly different terms of armor profile and spacing. You probably won't have any sort of double hangar set up. But you're probably looking at a carrier with Japanese technology and Japanese ideas and inspiration, which they'd probably sold for the right amount of money, because both Germany and Japan always needed money. If you have that as your policy, go in, you can probably produce, I would say, because again, I'm going to talk about this problem with deck parking in the North Sea and North Atlantic, and the South Atlantic. Rather than all three of those bodies of water have a similar tendency of describing deck parked aircraft as kind of like, well, in the UK we have this advert going around for vegetables, which is eat them to defeat them. That is certainly what those bodies oceans felt about aircraft. They felt they'd eat them to defeat them, especially if they're deck parked. So that means you're limited to what aircraft you can stick in a hangar. So 42, 48 aircraft seems about right for a vessel Scharnhorst sized, built with Japanese ideas. And the Japanese ideas are probably also stretched to giving advice on selection of carrier aircraft or modification of carrier aircraft. So you might not have ME-109s with such spindly legs and landing gear. You might have the Fiesler 167, which was the torpedo bomber they produced, and most of their carrier design torpedo bombers could well be pushed forward. That's a fairly decent torpedo bomber. And the Strucker, it's a fairly decent dive bomber for a carrier. Yeah, they could go all that. They could produce a decent air group. And if you've got roughly 48 aircraft, you probably go for 16, 16, and 16, and probably some in reserve. Let's be honest, if we consider that's what the Japanese certainly do. You've got a 1 in 7 reserve up there, and you've got a 1 in 6 reserve here. So if we're talking 48 aircraft, they could be carrying 8 or so aircraft in reserve. It would fit. Maybe 9 to carry 3 airframes of each type. But it would be a suitable carrier. It would be fine for the Germans in terms of their operational capability. So with that all in mind, let's go to what do we have? We have 3 yards. We have hulls that can be built in roughly 18 months with only 3 weeks of transition. Hulls which can be armed with 6 15-inch guns in 3 twin turrets and 9 11-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, or an aircraft carrier the size of Shokaku. Broadly speaking, in terms of main deck, etc., Shokaku is what I'm looking at. Certainly that's the tech level I'd be looking at. And the thing is, I've put in the maximum build time. If you're building the same hull, same engine, same fit over and over again, you should get quicker. So they should actually drop down. I'm basically giving them a 19-month window. Honestly, you could be putting it down to a 17 or even 16-month window by the time you get to batch 3. because you know exactly what you need to do. You will be able to pre-order things exactly so that they're available, and you've got that repetition, you've got that flow going, that flow of supplies, the flow of the flow of technology, the flow of understanding, the flow of knowledge of the construction process. Because the people building the ships will have gone, yeah, we've done this before, we do this. Oh, we've seen that problem before, we solve it this way. The problem solving, everything that happens with the first batch goes way down once you're into batch 2, batch 3. And that's a really big advantage for the Germans, a really big advantage. Without much further ado, let's carry on. Let's see what we've got coming next. I was supposed to skip forward. It didn't. There it is. So, if we keep to a standard timeline of laying down, we have no factor in none of the quantity, the theoreticals which we can't really quantify in, the idea of the acceleration of the laying down and constructions. And let's be honest, between batch 1 and batch 2, if you're changing over to a carrier for one of the vessels and twin 15-inch guns for the two battleships, yeah, that's probably going to be roughly the same length of time. The interesting one comes in batch 3 to batch 4. In fact, batch 3 could well be completed and commissioned earlier than January 1942. I'm not sure how much earlier, but I would say you could probably be looking at January 1940 for batch 2, and you could probably be looking at as early as November 1941 for batch 3. But realistically, therefore, Germany ends up with completing, not necessarily available at the same time, 4 15-inch gunships, 3 11-inch gunships, and 2 carriers. And I'm not joking when I say at this point the Royal Navy have been carrying. If the Royal Navy is as it existed historically, and the Germans complete this much force, the Royal Navy are going to be looking around at, especially Churchill, who ordered the pause of capital ship construction and carrier construction, and going, you have neutered us. Because that will what will happen. But the thing is, if the Germans are building this level of force, that's unlikely to happen. There are going to be consequences. There are going to be things that happen in the wider force. One of the interesting debates I had on Thursday night when I did a live discussion of this all was bringing up the whole point of the tribal class. And this led to more than one person, actually about 3 or 4, commenting to me when I was talking about how there might be a flotilla of tribal class AA ships built in response as well. So an extra 8 or so vessels built with 4 4-inch twin 4-inch high angle mounts. Or maybe they go to all of them and they do the extra twin 4-inch high angle mount, and they retrofit X mount before the war even begins. That's quite a possible scenario. A number of people come to me and gone the idea of, oh well, what they've done is they put in fifth, and various positions they replace. Most of it's replacing the pom-pom position. That isn't going to happen. There's 2 reasons. One, if you add in a 5th mount for 4-inch high angle, the 4-inch guns there, you then need to work out where the ammunition storage is going to be, where the extra crew are going to be. You need to get up a line for resupply of that ammunition from the magazines to there. In other words, you need to do a lot of work to rework on design, and the whole point of it will be to build it quickly. Again, standardization coming in. The other point is, the Royal Navy really like their pom-poms. They really did like their pom-poms. And even if you are replacing the 4.7s with 4-inch to high-angle guns, you're not going to get rid of the pom-poms. Because you, again, have to remember the Royal Navy's layered sort of air defense scenario with their fleet in this period is that aircraft from your carriers, they might shoot down the enemy, but their main purpose is to break up large enemy groups of aircraft into squadrons. Maybe, squadrons and flights. Break them up. Break up their group with their concentration of aircraft as much as they can. Then the heavy AA, the 5.25, the 4-inch, the 4.5, the 4.7-inch at long range, etc., is to break up those groups of aircraft into flights of 1 or 2 aircraft. And then the 40mm is to engage those 1 or 2 aircraft as they come in closer. So you're not going to get rid of the 40mm to replace it with the 4-inch, because that's going to be getting rid of something to you're replacing it with something which does a different job. They have different roles in the mission profile. Now, with the Germans having this force, what are the reactions going to be? Well, Stardust, I'm going to tell us about the Germans. They are not going to start building more destroyers than they did historically. They had a real trouble getting more. I am going to standardize them, which is going to help them with force generation, but probably still none of it's going to happen, because if they still invade Norway, it's going to happen. The point is, though, why don't they build any more than they did historically? Because trying to get funding for destroyers was like trying to get blood out of a stone in Germany at this time period. The German government, the German ministries, they're all competing for prestige, and destroyers weren't seen as prestige assets. It's really kind of interesting scenario, because you have the Schnellboots, or E-boats, enemy boats as the Royal Navy's calling them. They are prestige. They're a lot smaller than the destroyers, but they are seen as these fast things, and it's competing with the Italians, who have these fast mast boats, and therefore they have to be faster and better, and they're all competing for who's got the fastest torpedo boat, and that's sexy, and that's amazing, and that's attracting, the image of the fascist state, and they want to build cruisers and things like that, because Germany hasn't had them, and build the bigger, more powerful ships. And the destroyers are stuck in the middle, where they want them to be cruisers, but they're not. And they just don't get the support they need. There's something which they really should have been pushing out, because let's be honest, if you've got the Baltic in your requirements of operational spears, the destroyer force should be a primary force for you. And they're training them and treating them and trying to grow them as if they are an elite, and they sort of they have people like Ludendorff who's leading them and is treating them and trying to propagate them as an elite, and yet they don't get the funding, they don't get the numbers of ships they really need until after they lose their ships, in which case they suddenly put some funding into crash building them because they realise there's a problem. But then they do the worst thing they could do to them: they take away their names. They take away the names of the ships and they replace them with numbers. Why? Because they think it's less bad in the news to lose a number than it is to lose a name. And that saps morale even more. And only a force which truly doesn't understand or doesn't care about its crew and its personnel would do that. It's the most efficient thing you can do. It's also the worst thing you can do for morale, is take away their name and give them a number. It's basic human psychology. So first to respond will be France. Now, Italy won't really respond, because honestly, Italy can't do much. They've locked themselves into one scenario and they're putting all their forces behind it. Plus, the Italians are building a supremely balanced force for what they need to do. They might accelerate their carrier program. That is a small possibility, but mainly that'll be a reaction to if the French accelerate the carrier program. And honestly, whilst I think the French will put some effort into getting the Ricolas in service as quickly as possible, the Dunkirks are locked in fairly quickly. They're building 2 of those. They're trying to keep to treaty standards. I don't think they go on order of third. I think the interesting thing is the Joffre class. I think the Joffre class and their large destroyers, the contre-torpedoes, are more likely to get the investment. And I think the Joffres could be accelerated. They could be shunted forward a year, even 18 months, in terms of their ordering scenario by the German procurement. Now, I have a reason for this. The French basically see their best way of securing naval power in the world by making themselves indispensable to the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's shortage is fast, capital ships to hunt down vessels which are affecting their trade. That's why the Dunkirks are so attractive to the Royal Navy. That's why those ships are so valued by the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's hunting groups, as they've been exercising with in repeated naval exercises in the 1920s and 30s, are based around a carrier and a fast a or two, one or two fast capital ships. There is a reason why Force H is structured as it is. It's nothing the Royal Navy haven't designed and already worked around. The idea of Force H was around for a long time, and prior to that, in World War II, there was Force K when it was first constituted. So, hunting forces of a fast carrier and fast capital ships, or a pair of fast capital ships, are well known and are part of the scenario. At the time when the French are building the Dunkirks, the British are short of fast capital ships, so the Dunkirks are advantaged that. If you consider a likely response for the British would be to speed up their construction of their carriers and their capital ships, i.e. King George V's, although probably won't change their initial loadout, because if they do change them, then that will actually take longer to get them into water than to just build as they were planned. Well, in that scenario, the requirement becomes, can you produce a whole hunting group that can slot into the British? I.e., if the British are supplying 3 hunting groups, or 4 hunting groups, can you supply a 4th or a 5th one? In which case you need a fast carrier. The Burn doesn't fit that category. The Burn is, I think it's the slowest carrier in actual service in the world at this time. And it's a really weird engine mix in that it has vertical triple expansion and turbines. It's a fun thing, the Burn. So I think getting a Joffre class in the water and in service will become a priority for the French. Especially when you consider that if the Germans are going to get something in the water, they want to match it. Now the thing is, the French are still being French in their design, in that they are trying to perfect the Burn methodologies and systems, rather than just going, how are the British, the Americans, and the Japanese doing this? Because they're the ones who operate more carriers than anyone else combined. In fact, at one point, the Royal Navy is operating more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world has aircraft carriers. And yet, still, the French are going the French route. Look, they're committed, and they're sure they're right. So, the likely response, Joffre in service, some more contre-torpilles, i.e. large destroyers built, and that's pretty much the French. The Royal Navy, well, I've already mentioned, I have a sneaking suspicion that you get an extra flotilla of Tribal class destroyers ordered. Why? Because the Tribal class, yes, they're built with low-angle 4.7-inch mounts, but that's not because the Royal Navy hasn't done testing, it's because the testing's produced a false positive. Exercises, and their likely opponents being torpedo bombers, and exercise results where the aircraft involved have inevitably gone after the maximum value, because let's be honest, in an exercise, you don't die for real. So if you are going to go for glory, you're going to go for the capital ship, you're going to go for the carrier. And that keeps happening in exercise, and they even go for the cruisers. In wartime, you go for whichever ship you think you can get at and get away alive, which is often destroyers on the edges of the task group. Well, the Royal Navy had these 2 false positives, so that's why they accepted a low angle rather than a dual purpose mount for the Tribals. Otherwise, they might have pushed harder on the 4.5-inch dual-purpose mount, which was similar to what's fitted onto, of course, the Illustrious class here. Or rather, the upper deck version of what this is a between-deck version. Now, if they did push, they could be 4.5s. And that would fit, because if we consider when they're ordered and they're laid down, 36, 37, it would work. It would be sensible and quite possible for them to push for that when you're considering what exactly the Germans will be doing at this point, because the Germans lay down 3 ships in May 1935. They lay down another 3 in January 1937. The other option that happens is they pursue the 4.7 inch as they did traditionally, but the moment they see the Germans are getting an aircraft carrier, they go run. The Germans have dive bombers. That's the focus going to be for them. These guns do not deal with dive bombers, so let's replace the X-mount with twin 4-inch, and let's maybe build, as they did historically in wartime, they did a crash build program of AA destroyers. HMS Legion and 3 of her sisters are good examples, because instead of them having the 6 4.7-inch guns in 3 twin mounts, they have 8 4-inch guns in 4 twin mounts. So you could, with a tribal class, you could go with that again. And yeah, the 4-inch is not as capable versus surface targets as the 4.7 in terms of its raw firepower, in terms of what the individual shell will do, but the rate of fire is far greater, and that will compensate for it, as wartime experience showed. I think the other big thing you get is, as I've already mentioned, the King George V's, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Illustrious class are accelerated in construction. The Royal Navy can afford to. They can push them through. They can maybe respond by ordering them slightly earlier. They have the industrial capacity, they have the infrastructure capacity to do so. It's going to put some pressure and some stresses on certain areas, but you can push them through. And if you are pushing through the King George V's, and you are pushing through the Illustrious class, rather than changing design, you're pushing them through, you can end up with the 5 ships in service very quickly. I would say myself, the RN could push the ordering through, because again, building 2 Scharnhorsts is a factor in the Royal Navy ordering King George and V and Prince of Wales in January 1937, and ordering 2 at that point, and then ordering Duke of York in they ordered in July 1936 and laid down in January 1937. Duke of York's ordered in November 1936 and laid down in May 1937. And Anson and Howe are ordered in April 1937 and laid down in July and June 1937. So I think what you would probably have, with the Germans building 3 fast capital ships, the British understanding that the Japanese are interested in such vessels, and knowing the Japanese have left the treaties, and starting off in May 1935, I wouldn't be surprised if you have the orders skip a little bit earlier. The British will probably try and push them, and if you look in the yard records, the earliest they could have started building KGV, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York, and I do think they'll be ordering a batch of 3, the earliest they could probably have got them in would have been December 1936, possibly November. But that would have required a lot of rejigging of what was being constructed and working around certain things. It might have even meant that Royal Oak would not get her modernisation. Which is annoying, as it's always been good to have modernised ships, but that's one of the scenarios you can go with. And Anson and Howe could be not that far long behind them. Because let's be honest, again, one of the things we've been over is that the Germans are wrestling with having 3 yards they can build these ships at. The British have built their capital ships at Vickers, Camel Laird's, John Brown, Swan Hunter, Fairfields, Vickers, Barrow and Furnace, Harlan and Wolff, and they've also got the naval dockyards as well, Devonport, etc., that they can go to. They've got a lot of yards they can go to build ships at. Build large ships at. This is their infrastructure advantage. Germany can build 3 at a time. And even under this scenario, where we're going for the most efficient design to build 3 of at a time, that they can pick on, i.e. the smallest of the options. The British, have got 10 or so yards, 12 if they prepared to put some investment that they can start the construction at. That's a big advantage in terms of carrier construction and in terms of capital ship construction. And if you think about it again, there is the fact that some of these ships can actually be built simultaneously next door to each other. I.e., they can build multiple ships at the same time in the same yard. That's an advantage. That is a major advantage. I think, therefore, what you see is an acceleration of the illustrious class. I wouldn't be surprised if formidable and it ends up being closer to indomitable in shape, i.e. they make the additional hangar. But I wouldn't be also surprised. I don't think you get more illustrious class ordered. I think they move on to the implacable class as quickly as they can, and they probably order 4 of those. The reasoning for that is the implacable is closer to what the Royal Navy actually wanted to build. The moment they're free of treaty, and if they have the justification of Germany's building aircraft carriers, Japan's doing what it's doing, we've now got a justification nearby, a justification far away, and we've got the Italians looking around the Mediterranean to justify everything, and they're building more than they did historically. Yeah, that's the Royal Navy's justification to the government of turning around and going, you know those implacables which are closer to our dream carrier in that they have the armour of the illustrious class and they have the air group of the Ark Royal. Yeah, we'd like as many of those as we can get, so we'd like to order 4, please. You know, that's the British stepping stone on towards the midway class, etc. Now, I think the other thing you have is an effect on the skewer, because one of the reasons and one of the justifications that the Royal Navy faces for its carrier fighter program being cut in 1939 as part of the same decision which pauses carrier and capital ship construction is that the Air Ministry is claiming they don't need to have a decent fighter because their carriers aren't going to be engaging other carriers in a war against Germany and Italy because they don't have carriers available at that time. If Germany has carriers very close to availability, and let's be honest, if it's going to be commissioned in February 1940, that means that thing is practically complete and available in September 1939 as far as British intelligence and information and war planning is going to be concerned. You are not going to cut that fighter program. So the Gullwing Spitfire, aka the original Seafire being built by Supermarine, could well enter service. And that has a very interesting effect, because if you have an airframe which is basically designed to receive the same engines, so you can do, but the only difference in it is the wing design to take the realities of landing on a carrier, etc. Hence, as a Gullwing Spitfire. If you've got that in service and it's going to receive similar engine upgrades as the Spitfire does simultaneously, you could have a very, 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 very scary interceptor for fleet work. And that would also change if we consider the illustrious class's air group. Because if you're considering the illustrious class and their original air group, we're talking about roughly 36 aircraft. The reason we're talking about 36 aircraft is because of the space for them to carry things. It's roughly 24 TSRs, Swordfish, torpedo spotter reconnaissance aircraft, the larger aircraft they carry, and 12 Fulmars, because they are large twin-seat fighters, twin-seat fighter reconnaissance aircraft. Well, if you have the Gullwing Seafire available, that can probably carry 18 of those in the same space that it would carry 12 Fulmars. And they're going to be better fighters. The Fulmars are not bad aircraft. Please note, the Fulmars create many aces. They do well in combat. When directed by radar and being used, they're designed to be used. They are very good and useful. And I won't be surprised if you end up with a scenario whereby a standard air group is 6 of those, 18 of the Seagulls, and 18 of the Swordfish, because they are useful for long-range escort and long-range missions. but that will have effects throughout the war and would have an effect on Taranto, etc. It would be a very capable air group. The whole point is it's going to have an effect on the Royal Navy, but the main thing it's going to do is going to keep at least one program alive, which was otherwise cut, and accelerate the production. And there's going to be no pause, no capital ship and carrier pause if the Germans have got these. The Germans are looking at going to have 5 capital ships and a carrier in service by February 1940. If Winston Churchill turns around and goes, you know what, I want to pause construction, especially as those are going to be fast capital ships. Let's be honest, the twin 15s, they are going to be fast battleships capable of 31 knots. That means the only ships that can catch them are going to be the British battlecruisers, and the British battlecruisers are battlecruisers, not fast battleships. They're not designed for that level of slogging match. Hood, in theory, but Hood isn't modernised. If Hood was modernised like Renown at this point, possibly. That's the other scenario you might see. You might also see the British accelerate the modernisation programme of the Queen Elizabeth class and the battle cruisers to deal with the Germans having more fast capital ships, because the fast capital ship is the nightmare for the Royal Navy. If the Germans get into the North Atlantic, somehow it will be with a fast capital ship. Now, that's the British nightmare in a scenario before the fall of France, the fall of Japan, the fall of Norway, and the fact that Italy and Japan both entered the war against them as well as Germany. That's a beyond nightmare scenario. Britain did actually consider the scenario of what happens if we end up fighting all 3 at once. That was a nightmare. We don't have the funding for that. We have the funding to fight any 2. We don't have the funding to fight all 3 at once. Under sort of the pre-10-year rule, and even the de facto 10-year rule still existing until 1937. They're investing to build up to that level, but they weren't going to get there till about 1942. Well, for the British, add in the fall of Norway. They never saw Norway falling. That's not a scenario they expect to happen. And the fall of France, no. That's definitely not supposed to happen. But this scenario could be kind of interesting, because again, with the German fast capital ships being stronger presence and more numerous, that's going to cause a change in the disposition of forces and the utility of certain forces. And that might have an impact on the wider war effort. In fact, it will. And the British plan for forces, by the way, before I get further on, because I know there's going to be someone who's going to be doing, oh, the British weren't building enough. The British plan was to build enough by 1942 they could hold in any 2 theatres and win a third. And pick whichever theatre they felt was going to be easiest to quickest to win, so they could win in that theatre, then bring the forces from that theatre to the next theatre, which would be quickest to win, add the forces to forces already there, which are holding there, to win there, and then sort of that was the plan. Not the plan to win in all 3 at the same time. No, they don't think they're going to get that big a checkbook opening. The Royal Navy does understand exactly how unlikely it is to get the government to spend any money. So, when war begins in September 1939, there'll be free Scharnhorsts available. Now, this is going to be interesting because it's also going to have an impact on the British. The impact it's going to have on the British is the displacement of their own fast capital ships. Originally, you have Repulse and Ark Royal and various other fast ships moving around. The Germans have 3 fast capital ships, not 2, but 3. You need a consequently increase in forces available in the North Atlantic, North Sea to counter those. Remember, the British have no idea when the Germans are going to put to sea. If the Germans put 1 ship to sea, they need to have 2 available to counter it, because you need a superiority in numbers. That's why Bismarck finds itself fighting 2 ships in every engagement, because the British go, well, you build a ship which might be able to win against 1. Yeah, will it win against 2? Odds are not in its favour. Odds turn in its favour once it has a golden BB, and, you know, HMS Prince of Wales turns out to be the most unlucky ship the Royal Navy ever has in service, but, as I said in the live, there always has to be a balance out there. To the cosmic plot armour that exists for HMS Warspite, there has to be a Prince of Wales. It's the natural order of things writing itself to back to the law of averages. If the Germans have 3 ships, therefore, and can deploy a squadron of 3, what are the Royal Navy going to be looking at? Well, the Royal Navy are going to be thinking about a squadron of 3 or 4 ships themselves, which means renowns in refit. If you have started off the King George V's, and this is one of the reasons why I would have said fast ships would have been started slightly earlier, if you have started them off, 3 of them at least, in December 1936, if we consider that King George V, with a significant pause, is commissioned in October 1940, but had been launched in February 1939, start them off 3 months earlier, November 1936, instead of January 1936, let's say 2 months earlier, they could well be all sort of in service, launched by January 1939. Will the British have them commissioned by September 1939? Probably not, but without any pause, with the facilities they have available, they are probably going to be commissioned by, I would argue strongly, they would be commissioned by June 1940. Roughly 18 months. And if you have the first 3 coming in June 1940 and the next couple months behind that with no pause, again, quite possible, that's going to be helpful for the British because they're going to be available. Now, there is a scenario, though, and this is also a scenario with the Germans having these ships, the British really crack on with the King George V's. And I consider that a slightly more likely scenario. I would consider it a likely scenario that they try and push everything to be available as soon as they can. In which case, they could, if they have launched 3 in January 1939, they could have as many as 3 commissioned in January 1940. They could commission them, get them from launching to commissioning in 12 months. And they could have all 5 in service by April 1940. With some of them more recently commissioned than others, but they could have all 5 available by April 1940. The thing is, you're also going to see a different deployment in terms of where they're putting ships. The plan had always been the fast the Queen Elizabeth rebuilds, the modernized Queen Elizabeth go and form the core of the Mediterranean to hold up the Italians because they felt they could match in with the Littorios. And let's be honest, Warspite is in that number, and with her plot armour, she probably can do. But other ships were to be spread around the world. Well, if the Germans have 3 11-inch battleships wandering around this period, you're going to have to think more about where you're concentrating your ships, how you're concentrating your ships. Conversely, the R-class might actually get a lot more effort put on them. Now, if you lose Royal Oak as you did historically because of the lack of investment in Scapa Flow, that's going to cause an even bigger problem for the British because that's a loss of a vessel which matters even more in a scenario where Germans have a third of these ships. Because the odds of them having 2 available to put to sea and able to send out goes up. The odds of them being able to send 3 to sea goes up. And therefore, if you have all 3 coming out to sea as a group, as they historically did operate as a pair, well, if you have it, instead of being the terrible twins, it's a terrible trio, or the triplets, every battleship consequently becomes even more important and the losses become even more. So, what does this have an impact on? That's going to have an impact on the Lion class. I think already the Lion class could well have been started a little bit earlier. I think they would have been ordered in groups sets of 3 rather than 2. They originally laid them down at Vickers Armstrong in the Walker Newcastle yard, and Temeraire at Camel Laird's in Birkenhead. I wouldn't be surprised if Conquerors lay down at the same time, and I wouldn't be surprised if they are all laid down. If they're ordered in the 1938 order, I wouldn't be surprised if they are laid down in 1938. Probably late 1938 again. Rather like the historically they were ordered in February 1939 and laid down in July and June 1939. If they're ordered in 1938, if the Royal Navy's really pushing through the order and it's got the political support to push through the orders, they could be far further along. You lose Royal Oak, as you did historically, they are going to push those along even faster. They are going to be getting emphasis. Now, this is going to have a consequence knock-on for Vanguard, because my theory is that if the Lions are in service, and they could be, early enough, or going to come into service early enough, you don't start Vanguard. You do not start Vanguard as a project, because you don't need to. It's useful to do, but if you already have the 16-inch guns further along, and if you are putting the pressure to the metal on the 16-inch guns, they could be further along, but also you might go, well, hang on, the new idea isn't working, let's go with the upgraded, reconfigured version of what will fit on Nelson and Rodney to begin with, and we'll wait for the other one to come available when it comes available. There are all sorts of options for the British to go down the route of. But again, if they're pushing slightly more emphasis on it because of the presence of the fast battleships, because again, as large a battle fleet as they don't have enough fast battleships to do fast capital ships to do their job, and they're all battle cruisers, not fast battleships. That's a problem for the Royal Navy, and that's something they've got to think about. I do think, as historically, I don't think the Americans do much, or rather, if they do, it's going to be included in their naval law, and it's going to be later on. And the Japanese won't respond at all, because frankly the Germans building up just helps them, and they're already at their max capacity. So I don't think much changes in this period, other than maybe the Royal Navy responding to the loss of Royal Oak by accelerating the Lion construction, and the King George V's, instead of being paused, being pushed as hard as they can. So normally you would take, in peacetime, roughly 18 months to commission a ship. And that's actually what King George V sort of takes, including the pause, because she's launched in February 1939 and commissioned in October 1940. Which, if you consider includes a pause, shows how much she could have been accelerated if they wanted to. It's the same with Prince of Wales. She's launched in May 1939, she's commissioned in January 1941. All these things could have been accelerated if you're counting it back earlier. If you have them being launched in December 1938, which they could have been, they could quite easily have been. If you have them then, well, if you consider 18 months from that point, would still have them being in service by June 1940, and if you cut that down to 12 months, you could have them definitely in service by January 1940. And that is when I strongly suspect you would at least have the first 3, if not most of them, coming into service quickly around about that point. So the main thing you've got is an acceleration of programs by the warring parties. Now comes April 1940, and this is a big thing, because if we go back to this scenario, the Germans could well have commissioned by this point 2 more battleships with twin 15-inch guns and a carrier. Now, one of the things that caused a discussion in live was my saying that, well, the medium bombers, which were a majority of the force and weren't as in great numbers as they would be later on, would not have prevented this. There were some people who took umbrage with this idea. They were going, well, you know, the bombers would be out, and The thing is, the bombers were dealing with such a range of targets as it was. There was a time spent trying to coordinate with the Air Ministry on exactly what the priorities should be. You must remember there's quite a large period at the beginning of World War II, which is a phony war. So, and there's lots of pulling of punches going on in that period that honestly I can see them still getting built and completed. And especially as they would have been launched, so all that they're being fitted out and finished in these months. That makes them far more difficult to try and take out if you're using medium bombers and you're doing it half-heartedly. So this means to support Norway operation, you have 3 11-inch ships, 2 15-inch ships, and a carrier available. That's great! Odds are you don't do anything different than you did historically in terms of destroyers and cruisers being used to get the troops in. But instead of the pair of Scharnhorst cruising up and down and basically trying to act as a deterrent to major British units getting involved, you could well have a force which would be built around the 2 15-inch ships and the carrier, but which would have the 3 Scharnhorst as well. And honestly, the 3 Scharnhorst, 11-inch Scharnhorst, would be the far more powerful members because they would have been the ones which are completely worked up. One of the problems I have with the German Navy and their commissioning strategy is if we base it on their average timelines of commissioning, they tend to commission things before they have been full testing and final trials. And the thing is, Hitler is as keen to use and show off his new toys as anyone else. So he will definitely have these come out to sea. Now this means a problem. This means a problem for the Germans. If they have got such a force operating together, British intelligence will pick that up. That's a major unit. They knew Scharnhorst and Eisenhower were coming out. They knew they were coming out as a pair. They think the Germans have 5 capital ships. Remember, the whole way through World War II, they never have really more than 2 available at any one point, and the British respond similarly. They respond by keeping a suitable force available. If they have 5 and a carrier, this is going to be a very different scenario. The British force structure sailing around is going to be a very different scenario. You're not talking about Britain going, you know what, we'll sail around with a couple of capital ships to see if we can find them in pairs. No, the British are going to be sailing around in maximum force so they can deal with the Germans. If they think the Germans are operating in 5 of a carrier, you can guarantee the British are operating in at least 5 and a carrier, maybe more. And this is where something really comes interesting, because what's available at this point? You might have the 5 King George V's. You might have Renown, Repulse, and Hood. But that's only 8 vessels, so that's 2 groups of 4 at best. In which case the Dunkirks become really important. I think you also would have probably at least a couple of the Illustrious class available, maybe 3 of the Illustrious class available, perhaps all 4. There's a good argument made that all 4, if you haven't paused and if you've been pushing the construction as hard as you could push it, all 4 could be available. You've got Ark Royal, you've got Glorious, you quite possibly have Courageous, because in a scenario where where the Germans are going to have a carrier available, especially your large fleet carriers, you're going to be even more protective of. So the idea of actually using them for anti-submarine warfare, and remember, they don't just use Courageous, they have Ark Royal out with her as well. They're risking 2 in that Bright Spark operation. The doctrine was to use carriers for anti-submarine warfare. The doctrine was not to use full fleet carriers, but they were the only vessels available, and, we'll fight. None of our opponents have a carrier, so it's fine to use them. And in this scenario, it's more likely that the Germans are having a carrier, or visible to be having a carrier soon, so the British will be slightly more protective of their carriers, so Courageous is probably still around. So you have Courageous, Glorious, Ark Royal, at least Illustrious. I would go Illustrious, Formidable, and Victorious. Let's just go for 3 of them available. And possibly Joffre. So the British could be looking at a scenario going, right, we have 10 capital ships. Let's form 2 hunting groups, 3 hunting groups, each of 3 or 4 capital ships. And then we have 6, 7 aircraft carriers, so we'll add in a couple of aircraft carriers to each group, and the idea is that you combine 2 groups, and one group pauses and the other group comes in and supports them, and you have 3 groups out hunting and supporting the forces in Norway. You would also want to have your R-class battleships going around providing fire support for the forces, because if you don't want them to run into this group to run into any force which doesn't have some battleships with them to defend them. And the R-class can't hunt them down, but if they run into 4 of the R-class sailing along quite happily, that's not going to be a force they want to fight. Because again, they might win. But fighting 4 R-class is going to cause sufficient damage. They're not going to get away from the rest of the force. And the Germans are probably still going to be operating under the same doctrine as Hitler insisted they operate on at the beginning, which was, and historically, which was run away and don't take damage. That's why Scharnhorst and Naval run away from Renown. I know I tend to joke about it because she's so furious, charging at them because of the loss of her destroyer. There is partially them thinking that she's being handed by and she's being crewed by absolute nutters. But the reality is, the reason they're running is because they've been ordered not to risk taking damage. Now, when you have a scenario of more carriers and more capital ships available, fast ships running around, the North Sea is one of those areas of water which can get very small very quickly. Especially if those carriers are being orientated around strike and locate at sea rather than support land operations. And yes, the Royal Navy would be shamelessly doing that and shamelessly ignoring the Air Ministry and Norwegian government's request for aids. They might be using HMS Furious to support them on that. I notice I didn't include her in the earlier analysis of the availability. She's available, she's wandering around, she could be used for that submission. But Ark Royal, illustrious, formidable, victorious, courageous, glorious, Joffre. Roughly 7. So again, if you wanted to, you could have the 3 French ships join up with 2 British carriers, 2 King George V's, and that's one of your hunting groups. That's the 4 capital ships and 3 carrier hunting groups, and then your other groups are 2 free capital ship formations and 2 carriers. That could well be what you have wandering around. None of those groups individually would want to fight this force. But the idea would be you'd have the 3 sailing around, so one, they could launch strikes, slow them down. And that's the primary thing, because if they slow them down, then, frankly, if they slow them down enough, the modernized Queen Elizabeths can get in the fight. If they slow them down enough, the modernized Queen Elizabeths can get in the fight. And one of the factors you've got to consider of, again, if the Germans are putting this much effort into building fast capital ships and are building 3, how has that affected the modernization of the Queen Elizabeths? Have they pushed for having using their boiler, the spare resources and spare power generated by the new boilers that they're fitting with, instead of maintaining their speed and using the extra weight it generates for other things, have they used that extra weight to include more of those faster, more powerful boilers, and so they've got higher speed? I doubt it. I think the King George V's accelerated would be considered enough, and the Illustrious accelerated would be considered enough, and would be also a way of doing it in such a way as it would also be seen as not in adding to international tensions, because after all it's 14-inch battleships and it's the Illustrious class carriers, which are officially, not able to carry as many aircraft as other people's carriers, so it's interesting. It's interesting. But you then will have the force out. What happens? Well, the thing is, the Germans have 1 carrier, And as good and as useful as it is, and capable as it is, I don't think it's going to steal an advantage on Britain doing multi-carrier operations. That's something they've practiced since the late 1920s, and especially since they have started appointing rear admiral aircraft carriers. They've been doing multi-carrier operations and how to do the fighter and defense doctrine. Something they don't get to do a lot, other than in the Mediterranean convoy scenarios and the Indian Ocean fleet, the Eastern Fleet, and then the Pacific Fleet in World War II, because they're often deploying their carriers around in ones that are sort of off to do because they've got so many operations going on. But they do have quite extensive multi-carrier operational doctrine developed. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see quite a strong fighter force. And again, remember those Seafires. By April 1940, they could well be in service. Maybe not a lot of them, but a couple of squadrons or more. In which case, probably with Sea Gladiators and Fulmars, they are going to be providing the air defense of the fleet. That mixture is interesting. They might not have Fulmars. They might just have Sea Gladiators and Seafires. I think they would have some Fulmars, though. I think they would have wanted those quickly built as well. Maximising resources and available production. What happens? Well, under that scenario, I think any German strike, especially if they've got the same torpedo issues happening as historically happened, and they're dealing with the fighters, and considering Stuka's performance anytime they find decent fighters, sort of engaging them, I would say odds are any German strike doesn't do necessarily that well. But any British strike is going to be focusing in on the carrier, but possibly on the 11-inch ships, because I have this feeling the Germans would be running a sort of scenario where you'd have an 11-inch ship at the front, then a 15-inch ship, then the carrier, then a 15-inch ship, and an 11-inch ship out on each of the wings. I think that'd be the scenario you'd be looking at, because that sort of provides them some protection and depth. So I wouldn't be surprised if at least one of the 11-inch ships get hit and the carrier gets hit. It might be a couple of 11-inch ships. I'm going to go with, for this scenario, a couple of 11-inch ships because they'll be more exposed, so it's going to be easier for torpedo bombers to focus in on them. And again, the torpedo bombers don't need to kill them. Please note, again, it can be a Bismarck scenario. You can just damage one lucky torpedo hitting the rudder can cause them to circle around, and that actually causes the Germans more problems, because then they have the question of, do they abandon the ship or do they try and tow it? If they try and tow it, they'll slow down the whole force. If they slow down the whole force, the British will be able to bring in all those hunter groups, maybe even some Queen Elizabeth, modernized Queen Elizabeths, because Warspites weren't running around at this point in this area as well, and defeat them in detail because of the sheer amount of force they'll turn up. And again, we can point to German submarines, but if we consider the number of submarines which try to torpedo Warspite as it's going into Narvik, yeah, that may not help much. And also then you have the sheer problem of coordinating submarines to get them to the point where your capital ships are going to be to fight the battle. You know, it's incredibly difficult when they try and do it for Bismarck. It would have still been very difficult under this scenario, because for a U-boat to move quickly, it has to be on the surface, in which case it becomes a very easy engagement for Royal Navy surface ships. For it to be undetected, it has to move under the sea, in which case it won't make it there on time. So, if the Germans are prepared to abandon ships like the orders Hitler gave Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, I think then you probably have two 11-inch ships left to them, tender mercies of the Royal Navy, and they get sunk in this scenario. I think the Royal Navy gets some scrapes, but I think the sheer preponderance of mass they would have responded to the German constructions with will have given them an advantage. But, again, think about the sheer amount of force which is now being tied down. You're tying down all of the King George V's. You're tying down Pretty much all the modern aircraft carriers now being tied down in the North Atlantic. So you're not able to deploy something to Force H because do you want to send Ark Royal down to Force H to sit down there when you could have the Germans breaking out into the North Atlantic? Is Ark Royal what you send? Or do you send, how do you operate? These things are going to change because of the risk. If the Germans manage to get the whole of Norway, as they did historically, this becomes a major issue. However, under this scenario, Germany has aircraft carriers and 5 capital ships. The threat of them breaking into the North Atlantic becomes even more so. I'm not sure if the British are... The British were historically not that keen on Norway being allowed to fall in the first place. I think they might try and push even harder to retain control of Norway. Or rather, retain the Norwegians in control of at least a portion of Norway. I think if this goes one of two ways. I think if there turns out to be a major battle and the German fleet is defeated in detail, especially after Narvik, which I think would have been different because I doubt Warspite would have been sent into it. I think under this scenario you don't risk Warspite, you send in a cruiser to back up the Tribals and the other destroyers. I think if you have Narvik and you have a major battle where the German fleet is wiped out, for whatever losses the Royal Navy suffers, if the German forces are all wiped out in a battle and the German destroyers being lost in Narvik, I think Norway might the operation in Norway might be sufficiently knocked down that the Germans do not push any further. They might be forced into a defensive mindset in Norway because of the loss of their naval power and how the British will handle it. Even if you have a battle where you lose just 2 ships, that's going to be a major loss for the Germans. Admittedly, they're going to be pushing on and going, oh, we've got 2 more 15-inch ships coming, another carrier coming, so we've got to really push hard on getting those into service. And I wouldn't be surprised if the remaining 11-inch ship gets adapted to a 15-inch gunship. But it's going to have consequences. It's going to have consequences. Then we have Operation Berlin, January 1941. Now, by this point, I expect the Germans to not have 3 11-inch ships. Now, these are I'm always listing the ships they've built, so these are the maximum they could have available. But as said, on this scenario, I'm reckoning they've lost at least 2 of the 11-inch ships in the North Sea battle. And why am I saying 2? The sheer number of carriers again. Think about that. Again, let's go through that. We've got possibly Joffre. We've got Ark Royal, Courageous, Glorious, Illustrious, Formidable, and Victorious. Think about the sheer number of airstrikes, especially the British methodology of launching continuous air and continuous strikes and continuous maintenance of aircraft in the air scenario. That's just not going to be good. Reckoning it's going to be at least 2 ships lost. Me erring on the side of caution and very much conservatively estimating that one. Because those ships only have to be damaged by the airstrikes for the Royal Navy to be able to wipe them out. Because I think the Germans leave them behind. Or if the Germans don't leave them behind, then they're sufficiently slowed down that they end up with having a major full-on battle. Now, that will help more airstrikes and mass airstrikes. The British are perfectly capable of doing an alpha strike if they want to. They orientate their decks around continuous operations rather than as the primary, rather than alpha strikes as the primary. But just like the Americans can do and Japanese can do continuous operations, if they are, with some effort, but they can from their flight decks, the British can do an alpha strike from their flight decks. They can arrange their aircraft and launch a mass strike. You would see that going in on that force. And then you would see the capital ships charging in. The thing is, after such a battle, even if France falls, The Dunkirks and Joffre will have been based out of Britain. They will have been part of the British formations. So they either end up interred in Britain and handed over to the Free French that way, or they go straight into the Free French. The odds are it's one of those two options, but they're probably going to end up going straight into the Free French and forming the core of the Free French, which might mean the senior admiral who's been deployed in charge of them, because don't doubt me, there will be a senior admiral who's been deployed with them as being in charge, might well be the most senior French officer away from their government, away, and be put in charge of all the Free French forces instead of Charles de Gaulle. Something which I'm sure no one will be upset with, but also could have a seriously interesting impact on the forces structures in North Africa, etc., and the later things with those if we have a French naval-led Free French formation. Now, when Operation Berlin takes place, and of course they break out by going up the North Sea, that's made possible by the fact they have complete control of Norway. If they have less than complete control of Norway, this becomes a very, very difficult operation. They can still potentially be getting up there with, I think the 11-inch ship that remains will be now being converted to a 15-inch ship, and I think the two 15-inch ships and the carrier would be the task force that would be going up there. And their idea would be a fast raiding force. They might well take some heavy cruisers as backup, or anything else that survived Norway as a backup. If the British have partial control of Norway, you're going to have flights going backwards and forwards of maritime patrol aircraft, which are going to be using their radar tech, and you're going to have formations sitting off behind that of carriers and capital ships in various task forces to be able to intercept the force. Again, if you've got your bases formation is 2 and 1, the British are probably going to be forming forces based on 3 and 2. So they have a superiority. They have a firepower advantage. And the idea, will be to get multiple of those task forces to engage. He has a Dunkirks and Joffre. Well, that's a far larger force available. And yes, he will have had to send something down to Gibraltar to cover it, but that's probably going to be courageous and glorious. You might well have a Force H which is centered around courageous and furious, actually. And you could well have had Glorious go and back up Eagle for carrying out Taranto. You might have even had they might have even sent an armoured carrier. They might have even sent Indomitable if it was available to the Mediterranean fleet, because again, the extra strike power being sent to the Mediterranean fleet would assist them in trying to deal with, especially for Taranto, deal with the risks of the Italians. Because again, you are prepared to take slightly greater risks to inflict more damage under this scenario for the British, because the threat of the Germans is so much greater in terms of their numbers. You have to keep more numbers back in UK home waters, because if they have 2 ships and you have to maintain 3 ships available to engage them, and you have to have maybe 2 of those, that's 6 ships. Right then, to guarantee those 6 ships at sea, you probably need 12 ships. So that's a huge part of a chunk of your force. So if you then consider what the Italians have, Littorios, etc., anything you can do which can reduce the Italian threat and reduce the German threat is going to be a viable option. And it's going to be something the British are going to be pushing for. So if you have Norway, it's a lot easier because you have the aircraft going backwards and forwards. You probably detect the fleet going through. You would manoeuvre in your forces, and you'd have a nice little battle, and I doubt they'd get away, because the scenario would probably set up to be bringing one task group from the southwest and one task group from the northeast, so that they get caught in a pincer. If you don't have Norway, things become more of a problem. But you still probably have carriers out there hunting alongside your groups. So with the greater carrier presence, instead of having a scenario where Rodney and Nelson, you notice I haven't mentioned them, or Warspite by name at this point, they're quite slow ships, and Nelson and Rodney could well be being positioned in certain places to make sure that the Germans do not attack certain convoys, or do not go into the Mediterranean, or various other scenarios that they could be positioned for. They could have been sent to reinforce the Mediterranean fleet to allow Warspite and the faster upgraded and modernized Queen Elizabeths to be used for other things. I think in this scenario, in a scenario where you don't have the Norway and the ability to refuel and rearm aircraft in Norway for long-range maritime patrol, I think you probably see it happen much as Operation Berlin did, with them going out and going around Iceland and basically getting into the North Atlantic. But with more carriers and combined task forces out there hunting for them, especially the French availability, I wouldn't be surprised if they get found, and again it turns into a sort of Bismarck-like scenario where they get struck and then they get attacked by capital ships. Because again, that's the British doctrine, that's what they do at Matapan. And that is the British battle doctrine, is to strike at long range and slow you down, then engage at night. If they have to engage in daytime, fire at long range to blind you, then close the decisive engagement ranges and sink you. If they're engaging you at night, close to you with their guns pointed at you and hold their fire until they see you start moving to your own guns. Literally, they don't fire until they see your guns start to move. They're holding to get as close as they can, because they know the closer they can get when they fire, the more damage they're going to cause. So, under this scenario, yeah, again, they might get away. They might do they might manage to do what Gneisenau did against Rodney and manage to run away, but you've got a far faster fleet out there and looking for them. And also by this point, you could very soon be seeing Lion class come available. So, war operations. What do I think happens after that? Well, if the Germans lose their capital ships and their carrier in 1941, then I am quite certain that the last ship the 11-inch ship that's been upgraded to a 15-inch ship becomes kind of a living embodiment of Tirpitz, being this threat wandering around but actually not being spotted, and Hitler abandons the surface fleet altogether. Abandoning surface fleet at that point and focusing in on the submarine fleet, perhaps, from 1941 onwards. That would cause a very big change in the war. It would make the Royal Navy's life a little bit easier because it would make the threat more one-dimensional. And with the increased assets, they'd probably move them out to the Mediterranean to help deal with the Italians, and probably quite a significant force out to the Far East to hopefully deter Japanese, but also keep it safe from German submarine forces. If you've got the Implacables being pushed on and the Lions being pushed on, those could come into service quite quickly, and then you'd have a really interesting scenario where you could see the Lions and the Implacables being sent to warm up for operations in the Indian Ocean. That would make them available for the Mediterranean fleet if they were needed, but it would also make them available for Far East deterrence missions, which could lead to a very interesting Force Z. There is the other option: the Germans double down and try and push through their remaining capital ships and try and get more of those into operations. If Hitler goes down that route, expect to see the Lions and the Illustriouses probably, but not the Implacables. I think the Implacables still get a Far East deployment. Be the core of the Atlantic fleet to watch for those formations, with it usually being 2 and 3 going around, but also Ark Royal and probably Joffre also working around with a force of Dunkirks and King George V's. It would be some interesting task forces being arranged and orientating themselves in operations. Broadly speaking, this scenario produces a lot more nightmares for the Royal Navy in terms of German force generation. But it also provides a lot more incentive and a lot easier argument for them to make to get funding. You have to remember, a big problem for the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s, especially in the 1930s, was the threat that they were pointing guns at quite regularly was the Japanese. And a large number of the British population and the political leadership, including Churchill, didn't take the Japanese seriously as a threat. They didn't. Well, actually, no, when I say that, they oscillated. At some points, they were taking them so seriously a threat they thought the Britain couldn't fight them. And at other points, they were going, well, they never fight us because we're so powerful compared to them, they'll never do it. It's just jumping from one side of the coin to the other, and there's apparently no rhyme or reason why. Summary. Honestly, this question is interesting for me because it shows that what the Germans could have done if they'd gone the other way. It's a good discussion point to think about the other option than going the Bismarck route and Tirpitz route and trying to build the most powerful ships they could build. Instead, they accept ships which are less powerful than the top of the range they could build, but they can build more of them and they can build them more efficiently so they can get more hulls in the water. It's an interesting can of worms to go digging in. It really is, because it's half a dozen of one and six of the other in terms of, yes, the Germans have more capability and will cause the Royal Navy more stress, but also this bigger visible threat will mean that the Royal Navy will be able to overmatch them because the British government will invest. Because the British government will take the Germans and the Italians serious where they don't more seriously than they take the Japanese. And that's what covers their pace of development and investment. And people can point to the Anglo-German Naval Treaty and go, well, Germany won't do this because of that. They can point to various treaties, but the point is, how do you enforce a treaty? And this is the final scenario. How do you enforce a treaty? How do you enforce the naval treaties? Theoretically, if you break the treaty, the other powers will declare war on you to enforce it, but the whole point of the treaty is to try and avoid war because people don't want to pay the expense of going to war. They want to win the war without having to fight it. So if the Germans really break the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, is Neville Chamberlain going to turn around and go, let's go to war? Probably not. The Germans know this. Everyone knows this. Treaties have to be designed in such a way that you want to keep them. They have to be designed in scenarios to be as equitable as possible. This means they're often a compromise, but they have to be compromised in the right way. If you win on a treaty, you often sow yourself the seeds of problems later. Equitable means that everyone gets enough out of the treaty that it's worth their while accepting the compromises which are not in their favour in the treaty and following through. Because ultimately, the enforcement of a treaty, how do you enforce it? Well, you can do economic sanctions for an economic treaty, but again, you have to make that case. And if you're going, well, we're making this, we're going to do a massive economic sanctions against the Germans. Why? Because they've chosen to build an extra battleship than they were allocated. People look at you and go, well, that's one battleship. You're Britain. You've got 18 of the things at 15, 18 of the things. Why are you getting so bent out of shape? Once you've got the King George V's on order, if you think the Royal Navy, they have the 5 R's, they have the 5 Queen Elizabeths, they have Renown, Repulse and Hood, that's 13, they have Nelson and Rodney, that takes it up to 15, then you have other ships at certain points wandering around, but you also have King George V, Prince of Wales, Duke of York, Anson, and Howe under construction. For the Royal Navy to, that's roughly 20 capital ships. Saying we're going to do massive economic sanctions against the Germans, want everyone to sanction them because they're building one extra, when you're building 5, and that's before we start ordering the Lions, you could be order 3 of those. You could be ordering 8 of those on order. In which case you've got 23 capital ships either on order, under construction, or in service. It looks mean. It looks silly. No one's going to support you on that. So that's the problem with treaties. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I do always finish these videos with a question. And today's question is this. I distinctly ignored the likely reality that Mussolini pushes for a carrier as well. If Hitler's got a carrier and building a carrier, Mussolini will probably want one. Despite the legitimate arguments you can make against the Regia Marina needing one in the Mediterranean, considering their scope of operations, or despite the arguments that the Regia Aeronautica would, the fact that the reason they don't have one realistically is because of the battles between the Regia Aeronautica and the Regia Marina, they would likely end up having one, because if that other boy has a big flashy toy, I want the same flashy toy scenario would be going on. And dictators are all about the flashy toys. It's to do with the first 3 letters of their title. What do you think that would have as an impact on operations? How do you think that would affect things? Before coming up, well, today is the 18th when I'm finishing recording this, because I finished recording this at 1 AM in the morning, because I said I had to take Mum to hospital and sort her out. She's okay, she's back fine. Very nice doctor. Highly recommend Falmouth. I think they're a minor care unit. They're really good. They're really good at taking care of her. This week we've got coming up, building the fleets of Toshima. Yes, I've got that written. I just haven't recorded that. That's hopefully going to be Monday's recording. Fun times. And what we also have, we have Operation Berlin, a failure of both sides. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And take care.